For centuries, angels have been imagined as human-like figures, with calm faces, white wings, and an appearance meant to inspire comfort and familiarity. But when we open the Bible and read it carefully, we discover that this image does not come from Scripture itself, but from centuries of art, culture, and a deeply human need to soften what we cannot fully understand. The Bible does not try to make angels feel familiar, comfortable, or close to everyday human experience. And in fact, when angels appear in the biblical text, the human reaction is rarely curiosity or admiration, but rather awe, fear, and a profound awareness of standing before something that does not belong to this world. This forces us to ask an uncomfortable yet necessary question. What if angels were never created to feel familiar to us? And what if the image we have inherited comes not from the Bible, but from our desire to make the unknown easier to grasp? When the prophets describe what they see, they do not use gentle or comforting language, but words that struggle to surround something strange, powerful, and difficult to express in human terms. As we see with the prophet Ezekiel, who speaks of wheels moving without turning, covered with eyes, and beings supporting a reality that defies simple description. Ezekiel himself says that what he saw resembled the glory of the Lord, and that when he witnessed it, he fell face down, not because it was merely beautiful, but because it was overwhelming and impossible to process with a limited human mind. Isaiah, in a similar way, does not describe angels calmly speaking with people, but being surrounded by holiness and fire, proclaiming without ceasing that God is holy. Holy, holy, a scene that produces not comfort, but a deep awareness of who God is and who the human being is in comparison. And this matters, because the Bible never presents angels as the center of the story, nor as characters designed to draw attention to themselves, but as reflections of something far greater, of a reality so elevated that human language can barely hold it without breaking. That is why, in this video, we will not talk about angels as decorative figures of heaven, nor as beings meant to reassure our imagination, but instead, we will walk through the different levels and functions of angels, clearly distinguishing what the Bible states directly, what can be responsibly inferred, and what comes from later historical traditions. And as we move forward, one pattern will become increasingly clear. The closer an angel is to the presence of God, the less human it appears, the harder it becomes to describe, and the further it moves from any image shaped by popular culture. Because angels were not created to be understood, but to exist where human beings cannot remain. And once we grasp this, the final question is no longer what angels look like, but what their strangeness reveals about the God they serve. When the Bible speaks about angels who interact directly with human beings, it does so in a very specific way, because these angels are not the most powerful, nor the closest to the presence of God, but they are the most visible within the biblical story, and the ones who most frequently come into contact with the human world. These angels do not appear to draw attention to themselves or to be admired, but to fulfill a concrete and limited mission in time, arriving, carrying out a specific task, and then disappearing, as if their presence was never meant to become the focus of the narrative. Scripture describes them primarily as those who are sent, and the book of Hebrews expresses this clearly when it says that angels are ministering spirits, sent to serve those who will inherit salvation, showing us that their role is not to govern or to decide, but to obey and to execute what has already been determined from a higher realm. Because of this, even though many stories, names, and hierarchies have been attributed to them over time, the biblical text remains sober and precise, rarely pausing to describe their appearance. And when it does, it is not to exalt the angel, but to highlight the authority of the message being delivered. A clear example of this can be found in the book of Daniel, where an angel intervenes to protect him in what appears to be an impossible situation, not through a dramatic display of power, but through a direct and decisive action that changes the outcome without the need for explanation. In a similar way, in the Gospels, the angels who announce decisive events, such as the birth of Jesus, do not come to establish an ongoing relationship with people, but to declare something that has already been decided, something that does not depend on human response, but on the will of God. This helps us understand an important truth. The power of these angels is not found in their form or in the length of their presence, but in the authority they represent. Because they do not speak on their own behalf. They do not improvise, and they do not negotiate, but deliver with precision what they have been entrusted with. For this reason, even when their appearance is not described as frightening or strange, their presence is never casual, and those who encounter them in Scripture respond with reverence, fear, or silence, intuitively recognizing that they are standing before something that does not belong to the normal order of human experience. However, it is important to notice that these angels, despite being the closest to human experience, do not represent the center of the spiritual world, but only the first level of contact between heaven and earth, a kind of initial boundary where the divine communicates with the human, without yet revealing its full depth. And this is precisely why, as the biblical narrative continues, these messengers begin to fade from the foreground, not because they lose importance, but because Scripture gradually leads us toward realities that are broader and more complex, where the message no longer affects individuals alone, but entire nations, structures of power, and the course of history itself. It is at this point that we move beyond personal encounters and enter a realm where angelic intervention is tied to moments that shape entire eras, and it is there that the figure of the Archangel begins to emerge. As we move deeper into the biblical narrative, it becomes clear that not all angels are sent for the same kind of purpose. Because while many appear briefly to serve or protect, there are others whose presence is tied to decisive moments in history. Moments that do not affect just one person, but the direction of entire peoples and generations. This is where the figure of the Archangel begins to emerge, a term that the Bible uses sparingly and with great restraint, yet clearly enough to show that some angelic messengers are associated with missions that are not ordinary, repeated or routine, but rare, strategic, and deeply significant within God's plan. Scripture explicitly identifies Michael as an archangel, presenting him not as a ruler over all angels, but as a defender associated with critical spiritual conflict and with the protection of God's people, especially in moments where the outcome reaches far beyond individual circumstances. Gabriel, on the other hand, is never directly called an archangel in the biblical text, yet he appears repeatedly as the messenger, chosen to announce revelations that mark turning points in redemptive history, moments where long-standing promises move toward fulfillment and where God's purposes advance in a visible way. What this shows us is that archangels are not defined by constant activity or by daily interaction with humanity, but by the weight of the moments in which they appear. Because when they speak or act, history itself is being redirected. And like messenger angels, whose tasks may occur many times across different situations, the appearance of an archangel in Scripture is almost always connected to events that cannot be repeated, events that divide time into a before and an after. For this reason, the Bible does not focus on describing their form or establishing a detailed hierarchy around them, but instead emphasizes the significance of what they announce or defend, making it clear that their authority does not originate from themselves, but from the one who sends them. At this stage, the scale of the narrative begins to expand, because the focus shifts away from individual encounters and toward realities that shape the collective story of nations and peoples, preparing us to move beyond personal messages and into a dimension where angelic activity operates on a far broader level. From here, Scripture begins to hint at the existence of spiritual authorities that are not concerned with individuals at all, but with regions, kingdoms, and long stretches of history, revealing that the unseen world extends far beyond what personal experience can explain. And it is at this point that the Bible introduces us to the idea of spiritual authorities, whose influence is not local or temporary, but structural, marking the transition into the realm of principalities and powers. At this point in the biblical narrative, the scale shifts once again, because Scripture moves beyond individual encounters and begins to reveal realities that operate on a much broader level, a level where what is at stake is no longer a single life, but the direction of nations, kingdoms, and entire historical movements. Here we enter the realm of what the Bible refers to as principalities and powers, terms that do not describe angels speaking directly to human beings, but forms of spiritual authority connected to structures far larger than personal experience. One of the clearest examples of this appears in the book of Daniel, chapter 10, where a spiritual conflict unfolds behind visible historical events, and a messenger of God is resisted by what the text calls the Prince of the Kingdom of Persia, a figure that cannot be understood as a human ruler, but as a spiritual authority associated with a specific region and its political power. This passage is crucial because it shows that, according to the Bible, human history does not unfold in isolation, but is influenced by unseen realities that operate beyond what we can normally perceive, shaping outcomes over long periods of time and across entire civilizations. Unlike messenger angels or archangels, these authorities do not appear to deliver messages, offer guidance, or interact with individuals, but instead function within systems, exerting influence over cultures, empires, and historical trajectories. For this reason, when the Apostle Paul refers to principalities and powers in his letters, he does not describe their appearance or their form, but speaks of them in terms of authority and dominion, using language that points to roles and influence, rather than physical characteristics. This shift is significant because it tells us that as we move higher in scale, the Bible becomes less visual and more conceptual, less concerned with what these beings look like, and more focused on what they do within the larger structure of reality. Here, the conflict is no longer immediate or personal, but deep and systemic, woven into the rise and fall of nations, the direction of societies, and the unfolding of history itself, reminding us that the spiritual world described in Scripture does not revolve around human perspective. Yet even these powerful authorities do not represent the center of the spiritual order, because the Bible suggests that beyond conflict and influence, there exists a deeper layer of organization, one that does not operate through opposition, but through structure, continuity, and order. And it is precisely at this point that the narrative leads us away from spiritual struggle and toward a vision of how the unseen world is sustained, introducing us to the idea of an ordered system that holds everything together, and preparing us to explore what theology has long described as dominions and virtues. As the Bible draws our attention to the spiritual world at an even broader scale, it does not speak only of conflict, resistance, or authority, but also suggests something just as important, that this unseen realm does not function through chaos or improvisation, but through a deep and intentional order. It is at this point that terms such as dominions and virtues begin to appear, especially in the writings of the Apostle Paul, where they are mentioned alongside other forms of spiritual authority, yet without detailed explanations of how they operate or what they look like. Because Scripture does not describe these figures acting directly within human history or interacting with individuals, many theologians throughout the centuries have understood dominions as beings associated with administration, coordination, and the proper execution of what has already been determined, rather than as agents of visible intervention. In a similar way, virtues have often been interpreted as forces connected to the expression of divine power, not through confrontation or communication, but through strength, stability, and the sustained fulfillment of God's purposes across time. It is important to recognize that this understanding comes primarily from theological reflection and historical tradition, rather than from explicit biblical descriptions, and for that reason, it must be approached with clarity and honesty, distinguishing carefully between what Scripture states directly and what later thinkers inferred from its language. Far from weakening the biblical message, this distinction actually strengthens it, because it allows us to see that even where the Bible remains silent on details, it consistently presents the spiritual realm as ordered, intentional, and coherent, with nothing operating at random or outside of purpose. At this stage of the journey, it may feel as though the structure of the unseen world has become clear, as if we now possess a complete framework for understanding how everything fits together. But Scripture once again challenges that sense of certainty, because beyond organization and authority, the Bible introduces us to something far more severe and definitive: the existence of boundaries that cannot be crossed, spaces that are not open to exploration, and realities that are not meant to be approached but guarded. And it is precisely here that the narrative shifts once more, leading us away from administration and order and toward beings whose sole purpose is not to organize or influence, but to protect what has been declared holy. That is where the cherubim enter the story. At this stage of the biblical narrative, the tone shifts in a very noticeable way, because we are no longer dealing with messengers who move between heaven and earth, nor with authorities that influence history from behind the scenes, but with beings whose primary role is neither to communicate nor to administer, but to guard what has been declared absolutely sacred. This is where the cherubim appear, and the Bible is remarkably consistent in how it presents them, because every time they are mentioned, they are associated with boundaries, separation, and restricted access, making it clear that certain realities are not open to human approach. The first time cherubim appear in Scripture is not in heaven, but on earth, immediately after humanity is expelled from Eden, when the text says that God placed cherubim to guard the way to the tree of life, signaling that once a boundary is established by God, it cannot be crossed by human effort. Later, when the Bible describes the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, cherubim appear again, not as decorative elements, but as visible reminders that the presence of God is not to be approached casually or without authorization. In prophetic visions, especially in the book of Ezekiel, the cherubim are described with multiple faces and wings, imagery that is not meant to be aesthetically pleasing, but to communicate that these beings are not designed for human interaction, but for maintaining a clear and unbreakable division between the created world and what is utterly holy. Unlike messenger angels, cherubim do not speak to people, do not explain themselves, and do not announce messages, because their presence alone fulfills their purpose, which is to define the precise point where human access ends. This helps us understand something essential about biblical power, because power is not always expressed through action or force, but often through limitation, through boundaries, and through a firm refusal that does not require violence to be effective. The cherubim do not chase, argue, or persuade, they simply stand, and their presence is enough to make it unmistakably clear that some realities cannot be touched, manipulated, or understood from a human perspective. At this point in the journey, curiosity gives way to reverence, and the viewer begins to sense that the closer we move toward the center of the spiritual world, the less room there is for human participation, and the more evident the distance becomes between the divine and the created. Yet even these guardians, as imposing as they are, do not represent the ultimate core of the heavenly reality, because Scripture allows us to move one step further, toward a vision where the boundary is no longer defined by guardianship, but by the very structure that supports the glory of God. And it is at that point that the description becomes truly disorienting, because we enter the realm of the thrones, also known as the Ophanim, beings whose form and function challenge every human attempt to understand reality. As Scripture allows us to move even closer to the center of the heavenly reality, the language changes dramatically, because we are no longer dealing with messengers, guardians or administrators, but with something that appears to sustain the very movement of God's presence. This is where the prophet Ezekiel describes what tradition has called the thrones, also known as the Ophanim, a vision that is not meant to be simple or comforting, but honest about a reality that goes far beyond human understanding. Ezekiel does not describe human-like bodies, familiar wings or recognizable forms, but wheels within wheels that move in every direction without turning, completely covered with eyes and perfectly synchronized with the movement of the throne of God. The prophet emphasizes one crucial detail again and again, and that is that these beings do not move by their own initiative, nor do they choose their direction or speed, but advance exactly when the Spirit moves and remain still when the Spirit stops, as if their entire existence were perfectly aligned, with a will far greater than themselves. Their power is no longer expressed through messages, authority, or boundaries, but through structure, order, and alignment, revealing a vision of reality, where everything functions in precise harmony with the presence of God. The Ophanim do not speak to human beings, do not explain their purpose, and do not interact with history in visible ways, because their role is not to intervene, but to accompany the throne, to sustain its movement, and to reflect the glory that flows from God's presence. This leads us to a deeper realization, because in the Bible, the throne is not merely a symbol of authority, but the source from which order proceeds. And these beings are so closely connected to that throne that they cannot be understood independently from it. At this stage, form itself begins to lose importance, and language becomes almost insufficient. Not because Scripture lacks imagination, but because it is pointing us toward a reality where explanation gives way to reverence. Here the viewer may feel that the journey has reached the furthest limit of what can be described, as if nothing could exist beyond this strange and majestic vision. Yet Scripture invites us to take one final step, not towards something more complex in appearance, but towards something even deeper in meaning. Because beyond the structure that sustains glory, there are beings whose only purpose is not to support, to guard, or to govern, but to remain in the closest possible proximity to God, proclaiming His holiness without ceasing. And it is there that we encounter the Seraphim, the final and highest point of this ascent. When the Bible brings us to the point closest to the presence of God, we no longer encounter messengers, authorities, guardians, or structures that sustain the throne, but beings whose existence appears to revolve around a single reality, the absolute holiness of God. Here we meet the Seraphim, described directly in the book of Isaiah, not as figures meant to interact with creation, but as beings who dwell in the immediate proximity of God's presence, where human language can barely hold together without collapsing. Isaiah recounts seeing the Lord seated on a high and exalted throne, with seraphim above him, each one having 6 wings, using 2 to cover their faces, 2 to cover their feet, and 2 to fly. A description that is not meant to be visual decoration, but a declaration that even these beings cannot fully expose themselves before the fullness of divine glory. Unlike everything we have encountered so far, the seraphim are not sent to deliver messages. They do not guard boundaries, and they do not sustain structures, because their role is not outward-facing, but entirely oriented toward God. Their activity is not intervention, but proclamation. As the text says, they cry out continually, declaring that God is holy, 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 a repetition that does not suggest monotony, but completeness, as though human language must repeat itself in order, to gesture toward a reality it cannot fully contain. Here, power no longer appears as authority, order, or restraint, but as holiness itself, a holiness that does not need to be enforced or defended, because it simply is. And everything that approaches it must respond accordingly. At this point in the journey, form itself becomes secondary, because what matters is no longer how these beings appear, but what they represent. And what they represent is the truth that the greatest proximity to God does not produce familiarity, but reverence. The closer a being is to the presence of God, the less space there is for individuality, explanation, or visible action, and the more evident it becomes that everything exists for the sake of who God is, not for the sake of being observed or understood. This is why Scripture places the Seraphim at the highest point of this ascent, not to satisfy curiosity, but to teach us that the end of all spiritual inquiry is not complete knowledge, but humble recognition of divine holiness. And when we arrive here, there is nothing left to climb, because beyond continuous worship, there is no higher function, no clearer description, and no greater closeness that human language can express. What remains is silence, not an empty silence, but one filled with meaning, where everything that exists acknowledges, without the need for further explanation, the greatness of God. After moving through this ascent, from angels who interact with human beings to those who dwell in the immediate presence of God, it might feel as though the picture is now complete, as if the spiritual world could be fully understood through a clear and ordered structure. Yet the Bible intentionally disrupts that sense of closure by presenting figures that do not fit neatly into any defined level or hierarchy, reminding us that the unseen world was never meant to be reduced to a system that human reason can fully control. One of the most striking examples is what Scripture calls the angel of the Lord, a figure who appears throughout the biblical narrative, speaking with divine authority, receiving reverence, and acting as God himself, while still being described as one who is sent, a tension that has invited careful reflection for centuries and that cannot be resolved through simple classification. The Bible never explains this figure in detail, nor does it assign him a place within an angelic hierarchy. And this absence of explanation is not a flaw, but a deliberate signal that some realities are meant to remain mysterious, not because they are unclear, but because they point beyond categorization. Alongside this, Scripture also speaks of the heavenly hosts, not as a single type of angel with a defined appearance, but as vast, organized multitudes that appear at decisive moments, such as divine judgment, cosmic proclamation, or spiritual conflict, using collective language that emphasizes order and authority, rather than individual identity. In a similar way, the Bible refers to angels of judgment, beings who do not arrive to announce or explain, but to carry out decisions that have already been made, appearing at moments where history reaches irreversible turning points. These figures do not contradict what we have seen so far, but instead deepen it, because they show that the spiritual realm is not a rigid pyramid, but a living reality where certain functions operate across multiple levels and others stand entirely outside of human frameworks. This realization is essential because Scripture never promises a complete map of the unseen world, but offers just enough revelation to establish truth, order, and reverence, while withholding enough detail to prevent the illusion of mastery. Here, tension does not increase through visual complexity, but through intellectual humility, through the recognition that even after seeing as much as Scripture allows, there remain aspects of the spiritual world that resist final explanation. And it is precisely this recognition that prepares us for the final step, not toward another category of angels, but toward the underlying pattern that gives meaning to every role, every function, and every mystery we have encountered along the way. After walking through each of these figures and functions, from angels who interact directly with human beings to those who exist in the immediate proximity of God's holiness. A pattern begins to emerge clearly. Even though Scripture never states it as a formal rule, the Bible does not give us a closed hierarchy or a detailed organizational chart of the angelic world, but it consistently reveals something deeper. The closer a being is to the presence of God, the less human its form becomes, the harder it is to describe, and the further it moves away from anything familiar to human experience. Messenger angels speak, appear, and move within the human world because their role requires communication and proximity, while spiritual authorities operate at a distance, shaping events without direct interaction, and the administrators of order almost completely disappear from view. As we move further, the cherubim no longer speak or intervene, but guard. The thrones do not guard or communicate, but sustain, and the seraphim do not sustain or act, but remain in continual worship, showing that at the center of everything is not activity, but presence. This pattern reveals that the spiritual world, described in the Bible, does not revolve around humanity or around what we are able to understand, but around God and His holiness, with every other being existing in relation to that central reality. That is why, as we move closer to the heart of the biblical vision, Scripture gives us fewer details, not because information is lacking, but because human language reaches its limits, and reverence becomes more appropriate than explanation. Here we begin to understand that the strangeness of angels is not a problem to be solved, but a sign to be recognized, a reminder that the divine cannot be reduced to familiar categories without losing its meaning. This also explains why so many angelic descriptions feel fragmented, unsettling, or difficult to visualize, because their purpose is not to create clear mental images, but to redirect our attention away from themselves and toward the reality they reflect. Once we see this pattern, the question shifts, and instead of asking how angels are organized or how many types exist, we begin to ask what all of this reveals about God, because Scripture never presents these beings as ends in themselves, but as witnesses to something infinitely greater. And it is this understanding that allows us to bring the journey to a close, not with a definitive classification, but with a unifying insight that gives meaning to every level, every function, and every mystery we have explored. The angels, in all their diversity and strangeness, exist not to draw our attention, but to point us toward the greatness of God, a greatness that cannot be simplified, domesticated, or fully captured by human understanding. After completing this journey, from the angels who step briefly into human history to those who exist in the immediate presence of God, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The Bible never intended angels to be the focus of the story. In every role, at every level, and in every description we have explored, angels appear not as the center, but as reflections, as signs that point beyond themselves toward a reality far greater than anything they represent. The closer these beings are to God, the less attention they draw to themselves, the less they are explained, and the less they occupy the narrative, not because they diminish in importance, but because they exist in the presence of a glory that leaves no room for distraction. This teaches us something essential about the biblical worldview, because the spiritual realm is not revealed to satisfy curiosity or to give us a system we can master, but to place us in proper perspective before the holiness of God. Angels do not seek worship, they do not receive it, and they do not retain it, because their very existence is oriented toward redirecting all attention to the throne, to the source of authority, order, and life itself. When this becomes clear, the questions we ask begin to change, because instead of wondering how angels look, how many kinds exist, or how they are organized, we begin to ask what all of this reveals about God and about our place in relation to Him. Scripture answers that question not with technical definitions, but with an invitation to humility, awe, and reverence, reminding us that the divine cannot be reduced to familiar images without losing its depth and power. This is why the Bible gives us glimpses rather than full explanations, patterns rather than charts, and visions rather than systems, allowing us to see enough to trust, but not so much that we mistake knowledge for control. In the end, angels do not show us a detailed map of heaven, nor do they explain the unseen world in full, but they quietly remind us again and again of how vast, ordered, and holy God truly is. And if there is one message that remains after everything else fades, it is this: the angels were never meant to draw our gaze to themselves, but to lift it upward toward the greatness of the one they serve.